The Skull by Jon Klassen. One night, in the middle of the night, while everyone else was asleep, Ottila finally ran away. Ottila ran and ran. She ran through the trees and up hills. She ran for a long time, all through the night. Ottila had grown up in this forest, but after a while, the trees began to look different. They were getting closer together. Ottila kept running. As she ran, Ottila began to hear her name being called. She couldn't tell if it was someone's voice or the wind in her ears. Ottila, 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 Ottila. Ottila suddenly tripped on a fallen branch and fell hard into the snow. She didn't get up. She could not run any more. She listened for her name, but now it was quiet. Ottila lay in the snow and the dark and the quiet, and she cried. When she was done crying, she got up and began moving forward again. All at once, the trees stopped. She came out of the woods and into an open yard. In front of her, in the distance, was a very big, very old house. Ottila went up to the house. It looked abandoned, but when she tried to open the door, it was locked. She knocked loudly to see if anyone was inside, but nobody came to the door. "Hello?" she called out. "Hello," someone answered. Ottila looked up to where the voice had come from. In a window above the door, she saw a skull looking at her. The skull moved himself a little so he could see her better. "Hello," he said again. "Hello," said Ottila. "My name is Ottila. I ran away, and I need a place to hide and rest." The skull was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I will come down and let you in, but only if you promise to carry me once I do. I am just a skull, and rolling around is difficult for me." Ottila was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right." Skull left the window. Ottila waited outside the door. She waited for a long time. It was very quiet. Then she heard some small scratching on the other side of the door. The latch turned and the door cracked open against the snow. The skull pushed the door open wider. "Thank you," said Ottila. "You're welcome," said the skull. Ottila picked him up. She had never picked up a skull before. "Come in," said the skull. "I will show you the house." "All right," said Ottila. They walked into the hall. "It's a nice house," said Ottila. "Yes," said the skull. "I've always liked it here." "Have you lived here for a long time?" said Ottila. "Yes," said the skull. They went into a room. "This is the fireplace room," said the skull. "I come here to drink tea by the fire in the evenings." "You can make tea?" said Ottila. "No, not anymore," said the skull. "Can you make a fire?" said Ottila. "No," said the skull. They were quiet. "Is that you in the picture?" said Ottila. "It used to be," said the skull. They went into the garden room. "Oh, I like this room," said Ottila. "This is my favorite room," said the skull. "Can you eat the pears?" said Ottila. "I can eat the ones that fall on the ground, but I can't reach the good ones on the branches," said the skull. "I will get one for you," said Ottila. She held a pear for him, and he took a bite. The bite of pear went through him and fell on the floor. Ah, delicious, said the skull. Thank you. They went into a room with masks hung on the walls. What are these masks for? Said Ottila. I used to collect them, said the skull. Can you wear them? Said Ottila. They are just for show, said the skull. You're not supposed to wear them. They went downstairs. What is this room? Said Ottila. This is the dungeon, said the skull. There's nobody in it, right, in it now. What is that hole? What is this hole? Said Ottila. That is a bottomless pit, said the skull. Ottila threw the core of her pear into the hole and listened. It did not make a sound. Do you want to see the tower? Said the skull. All right, said Ottila. They climbed the stairs up the tower. Does anyone else know about this house? Said Ottila. No, said the skull. You are the first person to find it in a very long time. They got to the top and walked out onto the balcony. You can see everything from here, said the skull. It's beautiful, said Ottila. Careful, said the skull. The wall is not very high, and it is a long way down if you fall. They looked out over the forest. You said you ran away, said the skull. Yes, said Ottila. You don't want them to find you. No, said Ottila, I don't. The skull waited to see if she wanted to say any more, but she didn't. All right, said the skull. Then he said, there is a big room I haven't shown you. How big? Said Ottila. This is the biggest room I have ever seen, said Ottila. This is the ballroom, said the skull. It was for dancing. There were lots of dances here. I went to a dance once, said Ottila, but it was not in a room like this. I did like the dancing, though. I love dancing, said the skull. Ottila put her mask back on. She carried the skull to the middle of the ballroom. She held him to face her. Would you care to dance, sir? Said Ottila. Milady, said the skull. They danced and danced and danced until it got dark. When it was dark, Ottila made some tea and a fire in the fireplace room. Would you give me some tea, please? Said the skull. Ottila took a teacup and poured the tea through his mouth and onto the chair. Ah, nice and warm, said the skull. Thank you. You can spend the night here if you want to, said the skull. I do want to, said Ottila. There is something I should tell you, said the skull. Ottila put her tea down. There is a skeleton that comes here to this house, said the skull. It is a headless skeleton. It walks around the halls looking for me. When it finds me, it chases me. Has it ever caught you? Said Ottila. No, said the skull quietly, but I'm not as fast as I used to be. Ottila looked closely at the skull. You don't want it to catch you. No, whispered the skull. I don't. Will it come tonight? Said Ottila. The skull looked at the fire. It comes every night, he said. Ottila looked at the fire too. All right, she said. She kept looking at the fire, and she started to think. When it was time to go to sleep, the skull showed Ottila to a bedroom. It was a nice room. There was a big, comfortable bed and some pajamas for her to wear. Ottila liked the pajamas. We should try to get some sleep, said the skull. The skeleton will come soon enough. Ottila blew out the light. They slept deeply and peacefully for a long time. The house was dark and very quiet, until, in the middle of the night, a headless skeleton opened the bedroom door. From somewhere in the skeleton's chest came a voice, but it only shouted one thing. Give me that skull. I want that skull. The skeleton ran into the room. It was faster than Ottila expected. She had just enough time to grab the skull before it reached him. The skeleton pulled at the skull, trying to get him away from her, but Ottila held on tight. She did not let go. Finally, she got the skull free. She slipped past the skeleton and ran for the door. Give me that skull. I want that skull. Give me that skull. I want that skull. Give me that skull. I want that. They watched the skeleton fall into the dark until they heard it land, the sound of bones hitting the ground. They listened some more, but they did not hear anything after that. All right, said Ottila, time for bed. Ottila carried the skull quietly back down to the bedroom. She put him on the pillow and tucked him under the blanket. Then she put on her coat. Aren't you going to sleep too? Said the skull. In a little while, said Ottila, patting the skull gently. I'll be back soon. She blew out the light and closed the bedroom door. Ottila went to the kitchen and found a bucket, a kettle with tea leaves, a teacup, and a rolling pin. She then went out into the night and climbed down, slowly and carefully, to where the skeleton had fallen. When she got to the bottom, she found the skeleton's bones scattered everywhere. She gathered them into a bucket. She found every single one. Ottila carried the bucket of bones to a rock. She took a bone out of the bucket and put it on the rock. Then she took out the rolling pin, held it over her head, and smashed the bone. She smashed it over and over into smaller and smaller pieces until the pieces were as small as they could get. Then she took out another bone and she did it again. She did it to all of them. Then Ottila made a fire. She made it huge and hot. She melted some snow in the kettle with the tea leaves, and made tea over the fire. Then she took the bone pieces and threw them into the flames. She poured her tea into the teacup and drank it as she watched the pieces burn to ash. When the fire was over, she gathered the ashes into the bucket and carried it back up the hill, back to the house. She went down to the dungeon and dropped the whole bucket into the bottomless pit. She watched it fall into the dark and listened. It did not make a sound. Then she climbed back upstairs and went to bed. In the morning, Ottila and the skull had breakfast. Ottila made tea and picked some pears from the branches. I'm sorry last night was so frightening, said the skull. Ottila smiled and patted the skull. It's over now, she said. Thank you for helping me, said the skull. You're welcome, said Ottila. I wonder if the skeleton will ever come back, said the skull. Ottila cut a piece of pear. It won't, she said. The skull looked out the window. It's a nice day outside, he said. Do you want to go for a walk? They went for a walk. It was a nice day outside. Ottila stopped and gave the skull a bite of pear. It went through him and fell on the sled. Thank you, said the skull. He took another bite. You know, he said, chewing the pear, you could stay here with me if you want. Do you want me to stay? Said Ottila. Yes, said the skull. I do. All right, said Ottila.